Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of English Book on TV. We are your hosts. I'm Mr. Daryl.
I'm Miss Samantha, and today we'll be discussing The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare.
And this is for grades 10, 11, and 12.
Let's begin.
Let's have a look at the agenda. First, we will obviously have a look at the vocabulary as before, a look at the author, very famous, and a summary of the play.
After that, we'll really explore the characters, the setting, and some main themes before we conclude by reviewing what we discussed and giving you some homework.
My favorite part.
Now, our first vocabulary word comes from the title of our play, and that's merchant. Now, a merchant is a person who buys and sells goods for profit, otherwise known as a dealer or a trader.
Our next word is a suitor. Suitor. This is a man who pursues or tries to win the love of a woman.
Next, we have to loan. And to loan means to give someone something, usually money, for a temporary amount of time.
Following up on more economic terms, we have this phrasal verb, to pay interest, and that is to pay a percentage more than the full amount that you borrowed from someone when you pay it back to them.
And those words are important for our next one, and that's a moneylender. Now, a moneylender is a person whose business is loaning or lending money to others, who must then pay the money back with interest.
Now we come to the word anti-Semitism. This is discrimination against or prejudice shown towards Jewish people.
Next, we have flesh. Flesh is the soft substance of muscle and fat that's between the skin and bones of a human or animal.
And our last word is important. It's a play, and this is a piece of literature that was written for the theater, so as a dramatical piece. It narrates the story through actions and dialogues of the characters, and of course our work today is a play.
Yes, but before we get into the play, we should talk about our very famous author of the day to understand our text a little better. Now, Daryl, can you start us off?
Yeah, Shakespeare, William Shakespeare of the 16th century. He starts off in 1564 and he ends up in the beginning of the 17th century. 1616 is when he dies. He's really the most famous English poet, playwright, actor even, in the English language, and I think many countries around the world would agree that he is probably the best writer ever in the history of literature. He's got lots of famous characters as well. Well, Shakespeare was an English poet, playwright, and actor, widely regarded as the greatest of all time, whether it's in the English language, in German, whatever language. He has written famous characters like Hamlet, Romeo, Juliet, and in fact, Shylock in this play.
Now, Shakespeare wrote a lot. He wrote 39 plays and 154 sonnets, which is a type of poem. His plays have been translated into every major language, and they are performed more often than those of any other playwright. Shakespeare actually created many new words in the English language that we use today. Now, The Merchant of Venice is a typical example of a Shakespearean comedy, where the story's main conflict finds resolution before real harm comes to anyone. As in many Shakespearean comedies, the conflict at the center of The Merchant of Venice has the potential to end tragically. But it doesn't, so it's a comedy. And now let's take a look at what happens with our summary.
Let's get to it. Now, Antonio, a Venetian merchant, is depressed at the beginning. His friend Bassanio needs to win the love of a girl named Portia. a wealthy girl who lives in the city of Belmont, but Bassanio doesn't have enough money to marry her yet.
So Antonio suggests that Bassanio get a loan from Shylock, who's a Jewish man and one of the city's moneylenders. Antonio agrees to help Bassanio get the loan, offering to sign the contract for Bassanio.
In Belmont, Portia is sad because her father is forcing her to marry whichever suitor correctly chooses 3 boxes, a gold one, a silver one, and a lead one, which contains a picture of her. She already loves Bassanio and wants him to choose the correct box, but is worried that he'll choose incorrectly and they won't be able to marry.
Meanwhile, back in Venice, Antonio and Bassanio approach Shylock, the Jewish moneylender, for a loan. Shylock doesn't like Antonio, who's anti-Semitic.
Although Antonio refuses to apologize for his past behavior, Shylock agrees to lend Bassanio 3,000 ducats, that's the name of the money they had at that time, with no interest.
Shylock adds, however, that if the men cannot pay back the loan in time, Antonio must give up a pound of his flesh, which of course would kill him. Despite Bassanio's warnings, Antonio agrees.
Back in Belmont, Portia welcomes the 3 suitors. First is the Prince of Morocco, who has come in an attempt to choose the correct box to marry her. And the prince chooses the gold box, which is not the correct choice.
Next, the Prince of Aragon visits Portia. He chooses the silver box, which is also incorrect.
Finally, Bassanio picks the lead box, which is the correct one, and Bassanio and Portia are very happy, and they decide to get married.
The celebration, however, is cut short by the news that Antonio has lost his money in a shipping accident at sea. And that means that he cannot pay back his loan to Shylock in time, which means that he will have to give up a pound of his flesh. Bassanio immediately travels to Venice to try and save Antonio's life.
A trial is called to decide the matter, and the judge at the trial announces that he has sent for a legal expert who turns out to be Portia disguised as a young lawyer, and Shylock refuses at first several attempts to show mercy to Antonio.
But to find out how it all finally ends, you'll just have to read the play yourself. There's a surprising twist, and you'll really want to find out. So be sure to read it. Now, we talked about a lot of characters, so let's get into them some more.
Now, it being a play, the characters are the main thing, and here's one of them, Antonio, the merchant whose love for his friend Bassanio makes him sign Shylock's contract and almost lose his life in the process. Now, it being Shakespeare, the main characters are very complicated. He's melancholy and sad for no real reason, and as Shylock points out, he's also anti-Semitic. Nonetheless, Antonio is beloved by his friends and proves merciful to Shylock in the end, but with conditions on it.
Next, we have Bassanio. Bassanio is a man from Venice and a dear friend to Antonio. He is in love with the wealthy Portia, and that leads him to borrow money from Shylock, with Antonio signing the contract and putting his own flesh on the line. Bassanio is a poor businessman, but he proves himself to be a worthy suitor when he correctly chooses the box that contains Portia's picture and allowing them to get married.
Let's move to Portia now, the woman of interest for Bassanio. She's a wealthy young woman. She's intelligent, beautiful. She's in fact the cleverest person in the entire play. And it is actually Portia in the disguise of a lawyer that saves Antonio in the end from Shylock's knife.
And now, of course, we must talk about Shylock himself. Shylock is the Jewish moneylender in Venice. He's angered by his mistreatment by the Christians of Venice, especially Antonio. So Shylock schemes to get revenge by demanding as payment a pound of Antonio's flesh. Although he is seen by the rest of the characters as a monster, Shylock actually reveals himself at times to be quite human. And these contradictions have earned Shylock a place as one of Shakespeare's most memorable characters. So now that we know who this play is about, let's take a look at the when and where, our setting.
Let's look at the when first. So this is the late 16th century. It is the Elizabethan era, named after Elizabeth I. And it is a vibrant, active time with a lot of merchants and startup businessmen doing all sorts of things. Now, as you can tell from our summary, the idea of killing a merchant after he failed to pay his debts or loans was a common tale in England in the 16th century. It was a very fearful financial time. You could end up in prison, debtor's prison they used to call it. But in fact, it was also an anti-Semitic time. Jewish people were being blamed for all of these kinds of money-related worries and problems.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of money, that definitely brings us to the where of Venice. Now, the city-state of Venice really was the first major international financial center. And this made Venice a very wealthy city throughout most of its history. Also, because of its location, Venice was very dependent on the sea. And this plays into our play when the character Antonio, who is a sea merchant, loses his money due to the sea. There's also Belmont. And having these two different locations in the play causes excitement and tensions throughout as they travel back and forth between the two locations. And now I think that brings us, Daryl, to our main themes, which of course, as you'll remember, are the main ideas of our story.
Yes, Samantha, and I think we have two main themes we can focus on today. The first one would be the character of Shylock himself. Now, is he a sympathetic character or is he the villain of the play? You could make arguments for both sides, and I'll explain how. Now, is he the villain? Is he the bad guy? Many people in history have thought so, and in fact, this play has been used to support anti-Semitic ideas sometimes. Shylock is shown to be without mercy and to love money too much. However, on the other side, he is a bit sympathetic as well. He has his human side, and ultimately we can see in the details that what motivates him is not greed, but a deep hurt over many things. For example, Shylock's daughter sells his dead wife's ring for money, and he's hurt by that. Not so much the ring itself, he's hurt by the betrayal.
Mm-hmm. And now that brings us to our second main theme of the divine quality of mercy. Now, Portia makes a beautiful speech where she says that people should be more merciful, show more mercy, because it actually brings us closer to God and allows us to be more spiritual. She says that, and we learn that the law is there to be followed, but sometimes it should be broken. In this story, if everyone followed the law, a man would have lost his life simply because he could not pay back a loan in time, even though he was able to pay it back just days later. And it shows that not everything is always about our legal duties to the law. One must be able to forgive and show that divinity of mercy. There are so many more incredible themes to explore in The Merchant of Venice, but you'll have to do it yourself because we're almost out of time. So let's review what we discussed today. First, we talked about the very famous, very influential author, William Shakespeare. Then we moved on to a summary of The Merchant of Venice, followed by a look at 4 of our characters. Next, we moved on to the setting of the 16th century in Venice and Belmont, and finally, we discussed the 2 themes of villainy versus sympathy and mercy.
This would be a good time to look at the vocabulary of our day, of our lesson. And here are the words once more. A merchant, a suitor, to loan, to pay interest, a moneylender, anti-Semitism, flesh, and a play.
Now that brings us to our homework. We've loved hearing from you guys. You have such incredible ideas, so keep sending us your homework.
And I'll go straight to the question now. Do you think Antonio risking his life for Bassanio in the name of friendship was a smart decision or a foolish one, and why?
We can't wait to hear what you think. Be sure to send your answers to englishbookeducation.co.uk/homework. Thank you all so much for joining us today in our discussion. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye, everyone.
See you next time.